Housemaid warns CEO not to leave next day. His car explodes without him inside. Understood. Here's the rewritten part 1. The warning that changed everything, crafted in a continuous narrative flow with reduced use of full stops and commas, aiming for a smoother, more fluid rhythm suited for American storytelling tone, keeping the immersive pace, minimizing abrupt pauses, and not breaking the paragraph. The story remains cinematic and emotionally grounded, respecting the original mood and structure. Ethan Morrow moved through the hallway with the kind of quiet focus that came from years of living by structure and control and deadlines. His hand adjusting the silver cuff on his wrist while the other held his car key loosely like he had somewhere important to be and no time to spare. Because he did. Because this meeting could redefine everything. Because billions were at stake. And because that's what he built his life around. The next step, the next deal, the next proof that he'd made it. Without noise, without shortcuts, without losing himself, until she stopped him, until she knelt in front of him without warning, without sound, like something unseen had pushed her forward and dropped her to her knees. Hannah Lynn, the maid he barely ever noticed. The one who moved like silence, who worked before the alarm went off, who asked for nothing, who existed like a shadow in a perfect house, now on the cold floor, shaking, looking up with eyes red from something deeper than sleep, saying words he wasn't prepared to hear. Sir, please, don't leave the house today. And for a moment he didn't speak, didn't move, because it didn't fit, it didn't belong, it wasn't on the agenda, and yet it froze him, her voice, her face. The sheer weight of her fear, something he couldn't ignore even if he tried, and he did try. He tried to dismiss it as nonsense, as nerves, as maybe something she saw in a movie, until she added, quietly but with something unshakable, I saw you in a dream, wearing that suit, walking out that door, getting into your car and not coming back. And Ethan blinked because she didn't sound dramatic or unstable. She sounded scared, truly scared, not for herself, but for him, like she'd seen something she wasn't supposed to see. Something real, and that unsettled him more than anything had in years, and just as he was trying to speak, trying to regain footing in a moment that felt strangely unreal, Celeste entered, calm as always but with eyes that missed nothing. Already annoyed before she heard a word, asking what was going on like it was an inconvenience. And when Ethan told her Hannah didn't want him to leave, Celeste rolled her eyes and tore into the girl without hesitation, calling it nonsense. Saying this was what happened when help got too familiar, calling it embarrassing, even threatening to fire her on the spot. But Ethan, still frozen, still listening to something deeper than logic, said no, said wait, said, I'm not going, and Celeste's eyes widened with disbelief and frustration, but he didn't flinch, didn't explain. He just dropped his car key on the table like it no longer mattered, sat down on the edge of the couch with that look he got when deals got too quiet, when numbers didn't add up, when instincts began whispering, and in that moment the whisper in his chest was louder than Celeste's protests, louder than Hannah's trembling, louder than the buzzing phone in his pocket as Derek called again and again wondering where he was. Because something didn't feel right, not in a vague way, not in a mystical way, but in that quiet, primal way your gut warns you before your brain catches up. So he stayed, and he waited, and less than an hour later the call came in. The car had flipped. A truck had skidded into the freeway divider. There had been chaos, screaming, metal, smoke, and blood. The exact car he would have taken was now unrecognizable. The driver had survived, but barely, unconscious and pulled from the wreckage. And when Ethan heard it, he didn't speak, didn't react. He just stared at the car key he almost carried with him into death. And somewhere behind the noise of the house, the argument upstairs, and the silence between walls, he realized she'd saved his life. The girl no one noticed, the one who never asked for more than a thank you, the one who now walked past without saying anything else because she didn't need to, because her job was never just cleaning or serving tea or folding towels. It was something else, something neither of them could name yet. And Ethan sat still, heartbeat steady but shaken. No headlines, no sirens, just the sound of his own breath and the weight of a warning that wasn't a warning. It was a second chance disguised as a whisper from someone no one listened to, and he didn't know it then. But that whisper would become the thread that unraveled everything. She dropped to her knees without hesitation, her voice shaking, her hands clasped tightly in front of her like the weight of what she was about to say was heavier than the room could hold, and all she said was, Sir, please, don't leave the house today. And in that one line, everything that had once felt predictable and controlled about Ethan Morrow's morning unraveled in a way he couldn't name, couldn't prepare for, and definitely couldn't ignore. not when it came from Hannah Lynn, the maid he barely spoke to, the quiet one who never complained, never asked for anything, never existed in his life beyond freshly ironed shirts and a perfectly arranged breakfast tray, now trembling on the tile floor in front of the door he was supposed to walk out of, saying she had a dream, a clear one where he didn't come back, where there was blood and screaming and his name echoing through it all, and Ethan, for reasons he couldn't explain, didn't take another step forward, not because he believed in dreams or superstition, but because something in her voice felt too certain, too still, too honest to ignore, and it's in moments like this, when life whispers through unlikely mouths, that everything changes. If you're new here, welcome to Cracks of Light, a place where ordinary moments meet extraordinary truths, where stories unravel with quiet strength, and where sometimes the person the world overlooks becomes the reason someone survives, if that speaks to you. Hit subscribe, give this video a like, and help us keep telling stories that remind us all that light doesn't always come loud, but it always comes. Ethan didn't believe in signs, didn't believe in fate, didn't believe that a housemaid's dream could hold more weight than a billion-dollar business deal. But in that second, he didn't walk away either. He stood there frozen, heart unsettled, logic arguing with instinct, until Celeste came down the stairs, half-dressed in silk, irritated, and already dismissing Hannah before Ethan could say a word, calling it nonsense, calling Hannah delusional, and yet still, Ethan didn't move, didn't pick up his key again, didn't open the door, and when Celeste asked what he was doing, he said it softly but firmly, "I'm not going," and the look on her face said she thought he'd lost his mind, but he knew what he felt wasn't madness, it was warning, real and rooted and undeniable, so he sat down, stared at the floor, and let the phone ring, and ring, and ring again. Then the call came. The car was gone, flipped by a truck that lost control, the very car he would have been sitting in, the very time he would have been on that freeway, and all Ethan could do was breathe, slowly, carefully, as he processed the quiet horror of almost not being here, of being gone before he knew he should have stayed. Celeste didn't flinch when he told her, didn't ask how Sean was, didn't even fake concern, she just said, "You're here, aren't you?" and walked off like the miracle didn't matter, and that's when Ethan realized she hadn't just stopped caring. Maybe she'd never really started. And when he said, "I'm keeping her," and Celeste asked who, and he answered, "Hannah," it wasn't a decision made in pity, it was clarity, earned in silence, earned in fear, earned in the space between almost dying and still being here. And Hannah didn't say anything after that, didn't gloat, didn't ask for anything more, she just kept doing what she'd always done, working, observing, protecting in ways no one else noticed. What Ethan didn't know, not yet, was that this warning wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. He didn't talk to Hannah for 2 days after the accident, not because he was angry or confused, but because something inside him was recalibrating and he didn't have language for it yet. He just watched her from a distance, not like someone watching staff, but like someone trying to piece together what he'd missed, what he'd overlooked, how someone so quiet could have seen what he hadn't, and as he watched, he noticed things, how she moved with intention but never urgency, how she always finished a task before starting the next, how she never asked questions, never wasted words, how she seemed to understand the rhythm of the house better than anyone who lived in it, including him. And he realized that while Celeste played the part of a wife and Derek played the part of a friend, Hannah had never pretended to be anything, she just existed in truth, and now that made her the most honest person in his life. Which probably explained why Celeste suddenly had a problem with her, because Celeste didn't like anything that didn't bend or flatter or disappear when told, and Hannah didn't do any of those things anymore, especially not after Ethan had told the staff she was staying, and Celeste made sure he felt her disapproval in every slam drawer, every long silence, every sarcastic comment about the house profit. But Ethan didn't respond, didn't rise to the bait, didn't even argue when Celeste claimed she was the one trying to keep order in the house. He just kept watching, waiting, thinking, and that was new for him, because he'd always been a man of action, of certainty, but now his instincts were louder than his impulse, and they were telling him to be still and listen, and that's what he did. Until the night Hannah came into the dining room after clearing the plates and paused just long enough for him to notice, then leaned slightly, like someone who had something to say but didn't want anyone to hear it, and said, softly, "Sir," and he looked up and she said, "Please, don't sign anything this week," and he didn't even ask why at first, just stared, and she added, "I had another dream, clearer than before. I saw you sitting in your office with a pen in your hand, signing a document, and not long after that everything collapsed. You lost your company, your name, your freedom, you were handcuffed, sir, you were in court, but you didn't do anything wrong. And then she left, just like that, leaving behind a silence heavier than the one she entered with. And Ethan sat there, trying to make sense of it, not the dream itself, but the way she said it, like she'd already seen it happen. And for the first time in his life, he was afraid to sign his own name, so he reopened the folder Derek had given him a week earlier. The one marked with priority stickers and financial projections that looked too clean, too perfect, and he went line by line, checking bank codes, addresses, cross-referencing vendor names, and the deeper he went the more something felt off, not wrong, just misaligned, like someone had copied the blueprint of a real deal but changed just enough to hide a secret underneath it. So he called someone he hadn't spoken to in a while. A retired auditor who once cleaned up a government embezzlement case in 3 weeks flat, and said, "Look, I just need your eyes on something, off the record, no emails, no names." And within 24 hours she called back and said, "Somebody's playing with numbers." Slow and smart, but definitely playing. And that's when Ethan knew Hannah wasn't dreaming. She was warning, again, and this time it wasn't just his life on the line. It was everything he'd built, his legacy, his father's name. The company that had started from a folding table in a rented office with Derek by his side, and now Derek was the one sending him falsified paperwork with overseas accounts hidden in layers of shell corporations, and it would have worked too. Because on paper it was airtight, but Hannah's voice had cut through all of it, and now Ethan knew what he was dealing with wasn't just greed, it was betrayal, and betrayal didn't always knock on your front door. Sometimes it sat beside you at every board meeting, laughed at your jokes, toasted your wins, called you brother while planting the knife. And Ethan didn't confront Derek right away, he needed more. So he started testing, asking questions with answers he already knew, and watching the way Derek answered, too fast, too broad, too polished. And Celeste started acting nervous too, asking about his meetings again, pretending to care about his schedule after months of indifference, hovering outside his study like someone waiting for something to slip. And that's when Ethan knew they were connected. Not just emotionally but logistically, something was happening behind his back. And Hannah had seen the smoke before the fire even reached the curtains, and now Ethan had a choice, to play it smart or play it loud, and he chose smart, because when you know someone's trying to take everything from you, the last thing you do is let them know you've already started taking it back. Derek showed up at the house without warning like he always did, full of charm, cologne, and confidence, with that same rehearsed grin he used to win over investors and distract from the fine print, stepping inside like everything was normal. Like Ethan hadn't been dodging his calls for days, like the papers Ethan hadn't signed yet weren't sitting in a locked drawer waiting for exposure. He walked in and said, "Man, you've been ghosting me. What's going on with the deal? We're losing momentum." And Ethan nodded calmly without offering much, leading him to the study and closing the door slowly behind them. Derek launched into his pitch about urgency and timing and once-in-a-lifetime opportunities, and Ethan listened silently, just watching the way Derek spoke with his hands too much and blinked too fast like he was trying to sell something he didn't believe in. Finally, Ethan said, "I just need to review a few things, small technical issues, nothing big," and Derek tensed for half a second, before forcing a laugh and saying, "Come on bro, it's clean, you know it, we've done this 100 times, and Ethan didn't respond, didn't challenge. He just leaned back and said, "I'll have it sorted by Monday," then stood up to signal the conversation was over. Derek left reluctantly, and as soon as the front door shut, Ethan made a call to Claire, a former financial analyst from their firm who left 2 years ago on good terms, but always told him to reach out if things ever smelled wrong. She picked up on the second ring, and when he said, "I need eyes on a deal," she didn't ask why, she just said, "Send it to me off grid. No digital trail, and I'll have answers in 48 hours. Ethan delivered the documents by hand and went back to watching. Not numbers this time, but people, specifically Celeste, who had suddenly become more attentive, asking about meetings, offering to drop off envelopes, touching his shoulder with the same smile she hadn't used since year 2 of their marriage, and he knew it. Wasn't nostalgia, it was strategy. She was acting like someone who needed to know something quickly, someone under pressure, someone who wasn't in control anymore and couldn't figure out why. That night, Ethan left his office for 10 minutes, and when he returned, one drawer was slightly ajar, the one that held the unsigned contracts and 2 blank checks. She said she was looking for an old receipt, but she couldn't name from where or when, and when he said, "You're not even trying to lie well anymore," she just walked away without saying a word. The next morning, Claire called, and her voice wasn't calm, it was cold and direct and angry. She said Derek's been bleeding funds through offshore shells for the last 18 months, slowly enough to go unnoticed, but consistently enough to matter, layered behind fake companies, routed through Mauritius and BVI. And worst of all, the transaction fingerprints matched old access keys that Ethan himself used to sign during their last Dubai acquisition. Meaning if Ethan had signed this deal, the money trail would have pointed back to him and Derek would have walked clean. Ethan didn't react right away, just said thank you and hung up. Then sat at his desk in silence, not shocked, not even angry, just processing the fact that the man who once shared ramen with him on broke weekends had built an entire scheme designed to leave him holding the consequences. Betrayal wasn't just personal, it was professional, it was systemic, and it was tied to the woman he shared his bed with, and now he couldn't tell which one of them started it, but he knew they were in it together. That night he tested Celeste. Said casually that he might move the signing date up, and for the first time in weeks she looked directly at him, and said really with too much interest and too little delay, and he knew right then she was involved beyond the surface, not just passive, but coordinated. And Ethan didn't sleep that night. He stayed up reading old emails, rereading timelines, looking for cracks and patterns, and everything he saw confirmed what Hannah had warned. The paper trail was clean because it was designed that way. The trap was supposed to look like opportunity, and the exit was supposed to be Ethan's fall. The next morning, Ethan instructed his legal assistant to begin quiet preparations for internal restructuring and an emergency board review, but to keep it entirely offline. And when the assistant asked, should we alert Derek, Ethan said, not yet, we let him think. Everything's going according to plan. And for the next 3 days, Ethan played his role like nothing had changed, nodding in meetings, laughing at Derek's jokes, kissing Celeste on the cheek in the hallway, while mentally counting down how many days were left until they would both be out of his life permanently and for good. Celeste left the house early that morning with a suitcase she didn't normally use and a scarf that looked like she wanted to be seen but not recognized. She kissed Ethan on the cheek and said her father wasn't feeling well again, and she needed to spend a couple of days in his hometown to check on him. Ethan nodded and didn't question it because he already knew where she was going, not from assumption, but from confirmation, because the moment she started packing, he had already sent a private investigator to follow her movements discreetly without contact, without suspicion. And 2 hours later, the first update arrived. Celeste hadn't gone anywhere near her father's town. Instead, she checked into a boutique hotel in the heart of the city under a different name, room 406, one bag, no hesitation. 37 minutes later, Derek walked in wearing a black polo, hat pulled low, glasses on, head down. He didn't check in. He went straight to the elevator and straight to the same room. Ethan sat at his desk when the photos came in, and when he saw them, he didn't blink, didn't speak, didn't slam a fist on the table or throw his phone across the room, because by then it wasn't rage, it wasn't even betrayal anymore, it was confirmation. And when something deep down has been whispering at you for months and the truth finally catches up, it doesn't hit like thunder, it lands like silence. Later that day, he canceled all his meetings without explanation, drove across the city alone, without calling his driver, parked in a lot with no cameras, entered through the back of the building where the staff doors were, walked through the side hallway to avoid the main lobby, and when the receptionist tried to stop him, he dropped a folded stack of cash on the counter and said, I won't be long. She handed him the spare key without a word, and Ethan took the elevator up to the 4th floor. The hallway smelled of cheap air freshener and deception, and when he turned the key and opened the door, it was exactly as he expected. Celeste stood barefoot near the minibar, wearing a white hotel robe with a glass of wine in one hand and guilt barely forming behind her eyes. Derek was shirtless on the couch, scrolling through his phone like it was just another day. They both looked up and froze, and Ethan didn't speak, didn't react, didn't ask questions. He just stepped inside and shut the door gently behind him. The air shifted. Derek stood too fast. His voice cracked when he said, Bro, wait, this isn't what it looks like. Ethan raised one hand without making a sound, and Derek stopped mid-sentence. Celeste's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her throat moved like she wanted to speak, but couldn't find a version of the story she hadn't already destroyed. And finally, Ethan said nothing at all, just looked at them both for a moment, long enough for it to sting, long enough for them to realize there was nothing left to say. And then he turned and left the room the same way he entered. No sound, no chaos, just the weight of truth finally stepping into the light. He didn't drive home immediately. He sat in his car for 23 minutes with the engine off and his hands on the steering wheel, then finally pulled away and made 2 calls before he walked into the house, one to his lawyer and one to the company's legal auditor. He said, prepare divorce papers and begin the process to extract Derek from the business quietly but thoroughly. Don't make noise yet. Just start isolating, freezing, redirecting. When Celeste returned 2 days later, she acted like the trip had actually happened, said her father's doing better and maybe they should go see him together next week. Ethan didn't answer. Just handed her the envelope and said, you can have the house, the accounts, whatever you negotiated with him behind my back, but you don't get to keep my name. She opened it, saw what was inside, and said, you're doing this now, really? And he looked her in the eye and said, I should have done this a year ago. She tried the apology route, said it wasn't serious, that she felt lonely, that Ethan had been too married to work, too cold, too closed. And he said, you slept with the man I called brother and tried to walk away with half of what I built while I trusted both of you. Don't tell me about cold. She started crying, but the tears came late, the kind that showed up after exposure, not after guilt. And Ethan didn't wait for the rest. He just walked out of the room and let the silence handle what was left. The next morning she was gone, and the only thing she left behind was a broken teacup and a smear of lipstick on the mirror. Ethan didn't touch either of them. He just called the cleaner and kept going. The house felt bigger but not emptier. It felt like something had been removed that never really belonged, and he didn't cry, didn't replay it, didn't regret it, because when someone shows you who they are and you finally believe it, the hardest part is over. After Celeste left, Ethan didn't pause to reflect or wallow. He moved forward with precision, not driven by anger but by clarity, the kind that comes only after everything fake has been stripped away. He shifted his entire focus onto the company, onto the mechanics of control, authority, ownership, not to expand but to protect. He reviewed every contract Derek had touched in the last 2 years, every asset acquisition, every offshore affiliate, and the deeper he went the worse it got. What Claire found had only scratched the surface. Derek hadn't just rerouted funds, he'd slowly positioned himself to be untouchable, layered through shell corporations, fake consulting fees, subcontractors with silent equity tied back to him through relatives and aliases. Ethan brought in 2 more forensic analysts and locked down every financial channel within 48 hours. No press release, no warning. Just quiet internal dismantling of Derek's footprint from the inside out. He called in legal, dissolved 3 shadow partnerships, bought out 2 minor shareholders who had backed Derek blindly, rewrote the voting structure under a dormant clause buried in the original operating agreement that gave him temporary executive override in times of internal risk. By the end of the week, Derek was still showing up to the office with his usual smile and cologne, pretending like nothing had changed, but the access codes no longer worked, his emails bounced back, and his company issued cards had been revoked silently. The first time Derek confronted Ethan about it, Ethan simply handed him a sealed envelope and said, read this carefully. Inside were 32 pages of financial evidence, transaction logs, and a legal exit offer that gave Derek a choice: step down quietly and walk away with nothing but your name, or fight and go to court where everything becomes public and you lose more than money. Derek tried to bluff, said this would destroy both of them. Ethan looked him dead in the eye and said, only one of us built this, and only one of us turned it into a crime scene. The silence that followed made it clear who still had power and who never really did. Derek left without taking the envelope, but Ethan knew he'd read every word before midnight. By the end of the month, Derek was officially removed from the board, and the company began the slow process of cleaning out the systems he'd infected for over a year. While all of this unfolded, Celeste tried a different angle from outside the house now, calling staff, leaving voicemails, and more than once, accusing Hannah directly, saying she was the one who twisted Ethan, saying she was dangerous, manipulative, untrustworthy, that she'd cast some kind of spell. But no one believed her, and Ethan especially didn't. He had already seen what manipulation looked like, what quiet betrayal sounded like behind fake affection, and Hannah had done the opposite of all of that. She never asked for attention, never asked for credit, never asked to be believed, and yet she was the only one who saw the trap before it snapped shut, the only one who risked everything to speak up, the only one who told the truth when silence would have been safer. Ethan noticed how the other staff began treating her with quiet deference, not out of fear but out of recognition, that the most invisible person in the house had become the reason it was still standing. One morning, Ethan called a meeting with the household staff. Something he'd never done before. They gathered in the foyer awkwardly, unsure why they were there. Hannah stood off to the side with her head slightly lowered, and Ethan addressed them calmly but firmly. He said, I know this house has been through a lot lately, and some of you have probably heard things or wondered what's really going on. So let me make one thing absolutely clear. Hannah is not just a housekeeper. She is not just another name on payroll. She is someone I trust with my life, because she saved it, not once but twice, and anyone who disrespects her disrespects me. There was no applause, no dramatic music, just silence, followed by slow understanding, and when the staff dispersed, Hannah looked at Ethan with something between gratitude and disbelief, like she had never been publicly defended in her life, and didn't know what to do with it. He didn't say anything more. He just nodded once and walked away, letting that moment stand on its own. Over the next few weeks, Ethan began to change. In small ways that mattered more than the big ones, he started asking real questions in meetings instead of relying on summaries. He began walking the office floors again instead of hiding behind executive glass. He stopped dismissing junior staff and started listening to them. He removed 2 department heads that had coasted on loyalty to Derek, promoted fresh thinkers from within, and set a new tone that said we're not chasing growth, we're chasing integrity. Investors didn't all love it, but the numbers slowly started showing something more sustainable than before, a culture rooted in vigilance, not vanity. Back at home, he worked later hours but with more peace. The air felt lighter, the tension gone, and though he rarely said it, he knew deep down none of this would have been possible without Hannah, not because she changed him, but because she forced him to open his eyes and do it himself. It was late, the kind of late where even the clock seemed tired, the kind where thoughts echo louder than voices, and Ethan sat alone in the living room, not working, not planning, just sitting, still dressed from the day, undone tie around his neck. Tablet dark in front of him, no television, no background noise, just the soft hum of electricity and whatever silence feels like when it's not empty. And then she appeared, quietly, like she always did, no footsteps, no knocking, just Hannah standing in the doorway, hands folded in front of her, not with worry, not with nervousness, just with the kind of calm you only see in people who've already made their decision. And she said it simply, no build-up, no apology, no explanation. Just 7 words that stopped the air in his lungs. I'll be leaving tomorrow, Mr. Morrow. And at first Ethan didn't react, not because he didn't hear her, but because he didn't know what to do with what he'd heard, because in his mind she was still here, still part of the new reality he'd been rebuilding ever since the old one collapsed. And so he stood, slowly, unsure if he was about to ask her why or ask her not to. And when he did finally speak, all he said was, why would you leave now? You're safe here. You're trusted here. You earned your place here. But she shook her head gently and said, I didn't come to stay. I came to make sure you lived. Ethan looked at her and said, you don't owe me anything. You don't have to go just because things are better now. But she stepped forward, just a little, enough for her voice to reach without forcing it. And she said, I was never supposed to stay. I was supposed to help you see what you couldn't before. And now you see it. I was here for that, not for more. And Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, not grief exactly, not panic, but that kind of slow heaviness that comes when someone pulls the light from a room you just learned how to appreciate. And he said, I don't want to lose the only person in this house who's never lied to me. And she smiled, soft and knowing, not sad, not proud, just steady. And she said, I didn't lie, but I never really belonged either. You gave me protection when I needed it, and I gave you truth when you needed it more. That was our trade. And it was fair. And Ethan stepped closer now, not as her employer, not even as a man trying to stop someone from leaving, but as someone who didn't know how to thank her without sounding like he was begging her to stay. And she said, you don't have to say it. I already know. And he asked, where will you go? And she said, where I'm needed next. And that was all. No details, no names, like she was never just a maid but something more, something sent, something guided. And Ethan opened his mouth to speak again, but nothing came out. So she filled the silence for him. She said, you didn't sign the papers. You didn't step into the car. You didn't let comfort blind you again. You stayed. And now you're awake. That means I can go. And she turned and walked slowly toward the front door. No bag, no ceremony, just the final steps of someone who'd already said goodbye in her heart. And Ethan watched her reach for the handle. And just before she opened it, she looked back and said, live right. Trust slowly, love carefully, and listen when something doesn't feel right. Because not all warnings come twice. And then she opened the door, stepped into the early morning air, and disappeared. No cab waiting, no suitcase dragging, just gone. And Ethan stood there for what felt like an hour but was probably just seconds, then closed the door gently and leaned against it, eyes closed, breath deep, not because he was tired, but because he realized that whatever weight she'd been carrying for him all this time had just been handed back to him, and it was his now, not as a burden, but as a responsibility to carry it right. It took almost a year for Ethan to breathe like a man again, not just exist, not just lead, but actually breathe with purpose and clarity and without that heavy pause between every inhale that used to come from wondering who was lying to him behind a smile. The company changed first, not through press releases or public gestures but through structure. Ethan rewrote the rules, fired anyone who ever said yes too easily, brought back voices that had been buried under office politics and fake loyalty. He closed 3 projects that looked shiny but smelled wrong, walked away from millions because he'd rather rebuild on truth than drown in profit rooted in deceit. Board meetings became shorter, results became cleaner. And the people who stayed were the ones who knew why it mattered. No more champagne in back rooms, no more hollow toasts, just hard work, clean numbers, and a CEO who looked people in the eye again because he wasn't pretending anymore. At home the silence wasn't heavy. Now, it was honest. And when Ethan started sleeping again, it wasn't because the past stopped haunting him. It was because he stopped trying to erase it. He let it sit with him at night like a lesson that didn't need to be rewritten, just remembered. And somewhere in the quiet of that new rhythm, he met someone, not through business, not through connections, but by accident at a charity auction for an education nonprofit he almost didn't attend. She wasn't impressed by his last name, didn't ask about his house or car, asked instead about books, about values, about whether he believed people could change without losing who they were. They talked for hours, and he didn't tell her what he'd been through until much later because this time he wasn't trying to be impressive. He was just trying to be real, and she liked him that way, not for what he built, but for what he rebuilt, slowly, patiently, without noise, and they didn't rush into anything. No labels, no announcements, just 2 people showing up fully and consistently, and for Ethan, that was everything. And while Ethan was learning how to live again, in a different city, in a different part of the country, Hannah stepped out of a bus with a small bag and the same quiet presence she always carried. She walked past 3 houses before stopping at the one with the tension behind its perfect curtains. She rang the bell and waited. The woman who answered looked tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from work, but the kind that comes from pretending everything is fine while your soul is unraveling. Behind your smile, she asked, "Can I help you?" And Hannah said calmly, "I heard you were looking for help around the house. I'm available if you still need someone." The woman asked if she had references, and Hannah said, "I've worked in homes where trust had been broken and truth needed to be seen." The woman hesitated, looked back into the house where her husband's voice could be heard pretending to laugh through another phone call he thought she didn't know about, and she opened the door and said, "Come in." Hannah stepped through the doorway like a breeze no one expected but somehow always needed. She didn't carry an agenda, didn't ask questions. She just began where she always did, observing, listening, waiting for the moment when truth became more important than comfort. And in the background of that house with its cold air and polite silences, something had started shifting. Because Hannah wasn't just a maid, she was something else entirely, a reminder, a disruption, a light that slipped through the cracks when the walls began to rot from the inside. And the moment she entered, change began, not because she forced it, but because lies could never hold steady in the same room as someone willing to speak without fear. And so the story ends not with revenge, not with dramatic justice, not with grand speeches or courtroom showdowns, but with a man who learned how to live again and a woman who kept moving quietly from one broken space to another, never asking to be seen, never waiting to be thanked, just walking in when it mattered most. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you that sometimes the smallest voices carry the deepest truth, don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and most importantly, subscribe to Cracks of Light, where we share stories that honor quiet strength, deep transformation, and the power of listening when no one else does. We'll see you in the next one.